is the Halcyon News Network with breaking news. Halcyon Helen has been murdered. Administrator Ludovico of Rizzo's refused to answer the big question on everyone's mind. Who will Spectrum Vodka's next spokesperson be? Claiming that a special investigation must be concluded first.
The criminal investigation is simultaneously my favorite element and greatest disappointment when it comes to RPGs. I like the idea of gathering evidence, investigating leads, and listening to the testimony of victims, suspects, witnesses, and informants, all in an effort to solve a mystery. It's just the sort of thing that appeals to me, especially if it involves a good old-fashioned shootout. And since I've been down on the entire gaming industry lately, rather than just complain about the state of gaming in general, or call out a certain developer for their recent failure, I have vowed to examine something more specific. And that something is the intergalactic investigation, because just like Earth, space is no stranger to scum and villainy. The intergalactic investigator certainly has their work cut out for them if that's the path one wishes to follow, but I assure you, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. The countenance of the space detective is often that of a cringe grimace or something similar to seasickness, especially as he draws nigh to the conclusion of whatever enigma tickled his curiosity in the first place. Of course, not every developer bricks. There are some good investigation sequences out there. Some of them are even hiding in games you never would have expected to find them. But when it comes to playing detective, one developer in particular knows exactly what it's like to deliver both a fantastic experience and fail miserably at every turn, and that developer is Obsidian. Knights of the Old Republic is a good old game that is very near and dear to me, and while it would normally bother me to admit that a title released in 2003 was old, the truth is what matters to any good investigator, so we shall stick to the facts. Obsidian was also responsible for The Outer Worlds and the shockingly woeful inquiry following Ruth Bellamy's murder, so we will examine that as well. And while we have no direct evidence connecting Obsidian to Starfield, the Hope Tech conspiracy will be included in this case study anyway, just for shits and giggles. Though we should point out that Bethesda is rightly to blame for that catastrophic catastrophe, as they were clearly the mastermind and have even confessed to the crime. Whether they had help from other criminal organizations, however, is still an ongoing investigation. Shame on you, Bethesda. Take a bath. You smell like sin and bantha poodoo. With any luck, our examination will draw attention to the phantom menace responsible for the decay of modern gaming, though I think it ought to be obvious to even the narrowest of corporate goons. Unfortunately, we live in a world that overvalues data and undervalues those capable of interpreting it. So now that we've chased off all the short attention spans, let's get into this thing, because that is the real disease causing so many intolerable symptoms. Not just with gaming, but with society in general. It's why most of the YouTube content we used to enjoy is overstuffed with ads, and creators have taken to pumping out compilation videos in the hopes that you'll fall asleep watching them so they can get paid. This virus has affected us as a species, and the effect it's had on gaming was inevitable, creating a mind-numbing and unsatisfying experience for players. As they are no longer required to use their brain, they are expected to donate it. Nefarious plots and conspiracies aside, developers fear your inability to pay attention and your lack of intelligence will affect their bottom line. There's a reason Spacer's Choice uses the slogan, "You've tried the best, now try the rest." Mediocrity isn't a new concept for Obsidian. They've been all too happy to shoehorn woke propaganda into their games while providing lackluster experiences for quite some time. It didn't always used to be that way. There was a time when game developers made games. Some damn good ones, actually, and believe it or not, Obsidian was a part of that. Knights of the Old Republic is widely considered to be among the very best computer RPGs. Released in 2003 to universal praise and acclaim, it's still adored by fans after more than 20 years. And with good reason. It's a damn sight better than many of the more contemporary and technologically advanced games. But why? Even though we can rightly call it an RPG, it's really not much more than a point-and-click adventure, albeit a point-and-click adventure with some pretty cool animations and cutscenes. It's still basically a point-and-click, so what sets it apart from all the other lesser RPGs? Granted, Knights had decent voice acting, but that's not nearly enough to explain its success or solidify its position. So what exactly was it that made Knights of the Old Republic so memorable compared to more contemporary titles? Both The Outer Worlds and Starfield boast stunning high-resolution graphics, incredible cutscenes, expansive galaxies to explore, character development, equipment tinkering, and yet neither of them seem to have that secret sauce that made Knights of the Old Republic special. The Outer Worlds and Starfield are both a little weak on story, but that's not really the problem. Admittedly, Knights of the Old Republic wasn't very far ahead of them in that department. which leaves us with only one other thing that it could be. Since it's the only element left to talk about, the secret sauce to success must have something to do with player engagement. Like I said, this ought to be obvious to even the narrowest of corporate goons, but apparently it's not, so we have to say it loud enough for the kids in the back to hear. Players want to feel engaged with the game they are playing. They do not want to simply follow on-screen instructions. Walk over there, click here, shoot that thing, talk to the guy with the big green thingy floating over his head. That's not a video game. That's homework, dude. And it's boring. When do we get to the part where players actually get to play the game? Or is this it? We just follow on-screen instructions the whole time. It's not engaging, it's not immersive, and it's not fun. So what the hell does Intergalactic Investigations have to do with any of this? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I'm going to tell you. Even though we really just pointed out the major flaw in all new releases, the investigation sequence found in these three titles can illuminate the real problem with modern games in a very specific way. All three of them offer the player a chance to play detective during certain sections of the game, but only one of them is any good. With The Outer Worlds and Starfield, players don't actually do much investigating, and while both games offer the player nearly endless options for exploration, neither of them make that exploration rewarding. In stark contrast, there is very little to explore in Knights of the Old Republic, yet it somehow manages to provide the player with a much more satisfying experience. In both The Outer Worlds and Starfield, players simply follow the on-screen instructions at all times, and are never once challenged in any meaningful way. This is not limited to the investigation sequence, but prevails throughout, diluting the entire adventure, creating the aforementioned mind-numbing experience so many gamers complain about. If I didn't mention that before, I certainly should have, because this mind-numbing experience is responsible for the failure of so many modern games, and it has everything to do with player engagement. That is to say, how involved is the player in the events that unfold during the story of a game. The player's involvement is always important, but this is especially true of role-playing games. Knights of the Old Republic doesn't hold the player's hand, it doesn't have to. And while there might not be a whole lot of interesting things to discover, an interesting kind of synthetic exploration is created when players are simply given a name and must go find the person attached to it. They are given limited information, and throughout the entire game, players are tasked with investigating somewhat cryptic leads, never knowing what they might find or where their investigation will lead them. For example, players are given the assignment of investigating a certain disturbance in the Grove on Dantooine as part of their Jedi training. Knowing only that it has something to do with ancient ruins and possibly the Sith, players are surprised to discover a young Jedi is the cause of all the trouble and pick up a new companion by preventing her from turning to the dark side. Of course, there's quite a bit more to it than that, and the details of this event drive the story forward, but something else rather interesting occurs in that Grove. While exploring the dangerous grasslands of Dantooine, players are very likely to run across a Master Jedi who happens to be involved in a murder investigation. Seeing this as an opportunity to further the player's Jedi training, the Master invites the student to assist him in his effort to expose the perpetrator. The Outer Worlds and Starfield offer similar scenarios, each with its own unique setup, drawing the player into an investigation sequence by presenting them with a bit of mystery and intrigue, while offering them a puzzle to solve. The problem is, Knights of the Old Republic is the only one that offers the player a chance to actually solve a puzzle. The Outer Worlds and Starfield fail to deliver any such thing, in spite of sending players running from one end of the map to the other, and in the case of Starfield, a visit to several different star systems. The Outer Worlds, being the worst of the lot, is nothing more than a pointless wild goose chase, replete with ridiculous red herrings and circumstantial evidence which implicates every living creature in the universe. Players are tricked into running from one waypoint to another until they eventually realize they're being toyed with and say fuck it. Once the player has told the game they no longer wish to participate, the sequence ends and it's revealed that the Departed was in fact the killer the whole time. Well, sort of, but whatever. It doesn't matter. The whole thing was a complete waste of time. The player was never meant to investigate anything, nor were they ever meant to solve a puzzle. And to top this pile of dog shit with a bright red cherry, Obsidian didn't even bother to make the story interesting. Murder on Eridanos is absolute rubbish, and serves as a perfect example of everything wrong with modern game development. The player simply follows the boring on-screen instructions and listens to a whole lot of bullshit before finally getting bored and shutting the game off. To their credit, Bethesda did a much better job on story for their intergalactic investigation sequence. In Starfield, players are sort of suddenly caught up in a somewhat interesting conspiracy after falling in with the free-range Space Rangers, or something. The long and short of it is, someone is trying to run farmers off their land, and it is the job of the player to find out who and why. Or so we thought. It's a great start, and the story is good enough to keep gamers interested to the end if they're into that sort of thing. But the investigation falls completely flat. Players never really do any investigating at all, and there is no puzzle to be solved. As with the Outer Worlds, the on-screen instructions will guide the player through the thin and predictable plot until finally leaving them completely unfulfilled and unsatisfied. The developers of Knights of the Old Republic, however, knew the secret recipe and were competent enough to apply the special sauce. Players are instructed to listen carefully to each man's account and probe their holes, or probe their story for holes, not probe the suspect's holes. But what makes this so memorable and special is not the fact that we get to probe somebody's hole, but that there actually is an honest-to-God puzzle that needed solving. And it did need to be solved if the player wanted to conclude this sequence with their self-respect and dignity intact. Players were challenged to think and to engage with the story, and what's really cool is that the game actually allows players to get things only half right, giving them credit for a partial solve, explaining to the player what they missed. Holy shit. And for the record, this is just one of 2 instances where Knights of the Old Republic offers players a chance to engage in a sort of criminal investigation. Later in the game, there's a slightly more involved and more complicated puzzle to be solved in similar fashion. Modern games completely ignore this element, rarely offering players an opportunity to be a part of the story, let alone engage with it. And the sad part is that their developers actually believe they are offering these things because they don't seem to quite understand what it is that makes a video game fun to play. At any rate, that convoluted mess is my point, and I really don't know what else to say. I'm not very good at wrapping things up, the whole in conclusion, what have we learned part of the video, so I will just leave it here and let you decide whether or not my opinion on this matter has any value. Though to be clear, the point I was attempting to make with these meandering ramblings was that modern games lack engagement, either because developers believe we are too stupid to engage with their games, or they are too stupid to develop engaging games. Either way, it sucks, and it's heartbreaking to hear a once well-respected developer come out and flatly state that mediocrity is their goal. My dad is fond of saying, only when we strive for perfection can we achieve excellence, and I believe game developers ought to have a similar philosophy. Happy gaming, and thanks for watching.